The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Marcus adjusted his golden armor for the third time. He had been a royal guard for 8 years, standing watch over the kingdom's most precious treasures and protecting the royal family with his life. Today felt different, though he couldn't explain why. The air seemed heavier, filled with an unexplained tension that made his hand rest unconsciously on his sword hilt. As he took his position at the eastern gate, Marcus noticed the usual bustle of palace life around him. Servants hurried past with trays of food. Nobles discussed politics in hushed tones, and children from the nearby village played just beyond the palace walls. It was these children who often brought the only joy to his otherwise rigid daily routine. Their laughter echoed through the stone corridors, reminding him of a world beyond duty and protocol. Among these children, there was one who always caught his attention. A small girl, no more than 7 years old, with dark curls that bounced as she walked and eyes that held secrets far beyond her years. She appeared every day at the same time, always alone, always watching. The other guards had noticed her too, but they dismissed her as just another curious village child. Marcus felt differently. There was something about the way she observed everything, as if she understood things that adults had forgotten. The girl never spoke to any of the guards, never caused trouble, never even came too close to the palace walls. She would simply stand beneath the old oak tree, her small hands clasped behind her back, and watch. Sometimes Marcus caught her staring directly at him, and when their eyes met, she would offer the smallest of smiles before looking away. These brief moments had become the highlight of his otherwise monotonous days. On this particular morning, as Marcus settled into his post, he saw her approaching earlier than usual. She walked with purpose, her little feet moving quickly across the cobblestones. When she reached her usual spot under the oak tree, she didn't stop to stand and observe as she normally did. Instead, she continued walking, moving closer to the palace gate than she had ever dared before. Marcus felt his muscles tense as she approached. Palace protocol was clear about unauthorized individuals near the gates, especially children who might accidentally cause problems. He prepared to politely but firmly ask her to step back to a safe distance. But as she drew nearer, something in her expression stopped him. Her young face was serious, more serious than any child's face should be, and her dark eyes held an urgency that made his breath catch. When she was close enough that he could see the freckles scattered across her small nose, she stopped walking. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Marcus found himself studying her face, noticing details he had missed from a distance. Her clothes, while clean, were clearly mended in several places. Her shoes were worn, but well cared for. Everything about her spoke of a family that had little money but great love. Then, without warning, she did something that would change everything. The little girl raised her right hand and made a gesture that Marcus recognized immediately, though he hadn't seen it in many years. It was a sign used by the underground network that had helped people during the Great War, a silent way of identifying allies and asking for help. His father had taught him this gesture when he was barely older than this child, explaining that some knowledge was too dangerous to speak aloud but too important to forget. Marcus felt his heart begin to race. How could this small village girl know such a thing? The war had ended before she was born, and the network had disbanded long ago. Yet here she stood, making the ancient sign with perfect precision, her eyes never leaving his face as she waited for his response. The weight of his armor suddenly felt crushing, and the familiar sounds of the palace faded into background noise as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The girl's expression remained steady and patient, as if she had all the time in the world for him to understand. But Marcus could see the slight trembling in her small hand, the way she glanced quickly over her shoulder, the tension in her narrow shoulders. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had driven her to use such a dangerous and forgotten sign, it was urgent. She needed help, and somehow she knew that he might be the only person who could provide it. As recognition dawned in Marcus's eyes, the little girl nodded almost imperceptibly. Then she did something even more unexpected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of cloth, faded and worn but still recognizable. It was a fragment of the blue fabric that had been used to identify safe houses during the war, the same color his father had shown him in secret all those years ago. She held it briefly for him to see, then quickly tucked it back into her pocket. Marcus realized that his entire world was about to change. This was no ordinary village child, and this was no chance encounter. Someone from his past, someone who knew about his family's involvement in the resistance, had sent her. The question that burned in his mind was simple but terrifying. What could be so important that they would risk exposing themselves after all these years of silence? And more importantly, what would they ask him to do that would require him to abandon everything he had sworn to protect? Marcus felt sweat forming beneath his armor despite the cool morning air. The little girl continued to watch him with those knowing eyes, waiting for some sign that he understood her message. Around them, the normal life of the palace continued, unchanged. Guards walked their routes, servants carried out their duties, and nobles discussed their affairs, completely unaware that something extraordinary was happening just steps away from them. Taking a careful look around to ensure no one was observing them, Marcus gave a subtle nod. It was the response the girl had been waiting for. Her tense shoulders relaxed slightly, and she took a small step closer to the gate. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of years of planning and desperate hope. "My grandmother says you knew my grandfather during the troubled times," she said, her child's voice struggling with the gravity of her mission. "She says your father and mine worked together to help people escape when the soldiers came to burn the villages. She remembers your family name, Marcus, son of David the blacksmith." The mention of his father's name and profession sent a chill through Marcus's body. David the blacksmith had indeed been his father, and during the war, their forge had served as more than just a place to make horseshoes and repair tools. Hidden beneath the workshop had been a network of tunnels that helped families escape persecution. His father had risked everything to save lives, and Marcus had sworn never to speak of those dangerous times. "My grandmother is dying," the girl continued, her voice growing even quieter. "But before she goes, she says there's something your father hid that needs to be found. Something that could help many people who are in danger again. She sent me because she can't walk anymore, and because she says children are invisible to those who hunt adults." Marcus felt his throat tighten. The idea that the old dangers might be returning filled him with dread. During the war, his father had often spoken about how evil never truly disappeared. It just waited for people to forget their vigilance. If this child's grandmother was reaching out after so many years of silence, the situation must be desperate indeed. The girl glanced around nervously, then continued her story. "3 days ago, strange men came to our village asking questions about families who lived there during the war. They had lists of names, old names that most people had forgotten. But grandmother remembered, and she became very frightened. She says these men are looking for something specific, something they believe was hidden during the fighting." As Marcus listened, pieces of old memories began to surface. He remembered his father working late into the night on what he had called special projects. He recalled hushed conversations between his parents about hiding important documents and evidence that could change everything. At the time, Marcus had been too young to understand, but now he began to realize that his father might have been safeguarding secrets far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "She says your father told mine about a place where truth was, buried beneath iron and stone," the girl whispered urgently. "She says you would know where to look because you helped him dig when you were small. The men who came to our village, they're getting closer to finding it. Grandmother says if they discover what's hidden there first, many innocent people will suffer." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting his mind wander back to his childhood. He could almost hear his father's voice, could almost smell the coal smoke from the forge, could almost feel the weight of the small shovel his father had given him for what he had called their secret work. They had indeed dug together, but Marcus had thought they were simply preparing the ground for a new workshop. Could there have been another purpose to their midnight excavations? Opening his eyes, he looked down at the brave little girl who had risked so much to find him. Her face was filled with hope and trust, the kind of faith that children place in adults when they believe the grown-ups can fix anything. The weight of that trust felt heavier than his armor, more binding than his oath to the crown. "What does your grandmother want me to do?" Marcus asked, already knowing that his question meant he was prepared to help, regardless of the consequences. "She wants you to come home with me," the girl replied simply. "Tonight, when your duty ends and the moon is dark. She says the old paths are still safe for those who remember how to walk them. She needs to show you exactly where to look and tell you what to do with what you find. But she says, time is running very short. The strange men are coming back tomorrow." Marcus felt his world shifting beneath his feet. To leave his post even after his official duty hours ended was a serious violation of his oath as a royal guard. To follow a child into the night based on old wartime connections could be seen as treason. But to ignore a call for help from those who had once risked everything for justice felt like a betrayal of everything his father had taught him about honor and courage. Looking into the girl's earnest face, Marcus made his decision. Some duties ran deeper than uniforms and palace walls. Some oaths were written not in books of law, but in the human heart. If his father's legacy could help protect innocent people once again, then he would find the courage to follow where it led, even if it meant leaving behind the only life he had known for the past 8 years. "Tell your grandmother I will come," he whispered back. "When the church bell rings midnight, I'll meet you at the old bridge beyond the miller's house. Can you find your way there in the dark?" The little girl nodded solemnly, her mission accomplished. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her small figure disappearing into the shadows between buildings. Marcus watched her go, knowing that when the sun set that evening, he would be walking away from his comfortable, predictable life and into an uncertain future that carried both great danger and the possibility of redemption. The hours that followed their secret meeting felt like the longest of Marcus's life. Every minute seemed to stretch endlessly as he tried to maintain his normal routine, while his mind raced with possibilities and fears. His fellow guards noticed his distraction several times, asking if he felt unwell or needed to rest. Each time, Marcus forced a smile and claimed he was simply tired, though the truth was far more complicated. As evening approached, Marcus found himself studying every shadow, every face that passed by the palace gates. Were some of these people the mysterious strangers the little girl had mentioned? Had they already discovered whatever his father had hidden so many years ago? The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, making every breath feel labored. When his replacement arrived for the night shift, Marcus went through the familiar ritual of handing over his duties. He reported the day's activities, noting the usual visitors and deliveries, carefully omitting any mention of his conversation with the child. As he walked toward the guards' quarters to remove his armor, Marcus felt as if he were saying goodbye to his old life with each step. In his small room, Marcus changed from his official uniform into simple traveling clothes. He had decided to tell anyone who might ask that he was visiting his cousin in the next village, a lie that could be easily verified since he did indeed have relatives there. As he prepared for his midnight journey, Marcus found himself touching small items that held memories of his father. A simple knife with a wooden handle, a leather pouch that had belonged to his grandfather, and most importantly, a small iron ring that bore the mark of their family's forge. The church bell had just finished chiming 11 when Marcus slipped quietly from the palace grounds. Years of guard duty had taught him every path and shadow around the building. Knowledge that now served him well as he avoided the night patrols. Moving carefully through the sleeping town, Marcus made his way toward the old bridge where he had promised to meet his young guide. The bridge was a simple stone structure that had crossed the narrow river for over 100 years. During the day, it was a busy crossing point for farmers and merchants traveling between villages. At night, it became a lonely place where only the sound of flowing water broke the silence. Marcus arrived early, positioning himself in the shadow of an old willow tree where he could watch for the girl's approach while remaining hidden from any other travelers who might pass by. He didn't have to wait long. Just as the church bell began to toll midnight, a small figure emerged from the darkness on the far side of the bridge. The little girl moved with surprising confidence for someone her age traveling alone at night. She had changed from her daytime dress into dark clothing that helped her blend with the shadows, and Marcus noticed she carried a small bundle slung across her shoulder. When she reached his hiding place, she whispered a greeting and gestured for him to follow. Without any further conversation, they began walking along a path that led away from the main road and into the countryside. Marcus soon realized that the girl knew these routes far better than he did. She led him through shortcuts that avoided farmhouses where dogs might bark, around fields where their footsteps would leave obvious tracks, and along streams where the sound of water would mask any noise they made. As they walked, Marcus found himself remembering stories his father had told about the secret networks that had operated during the war, groups of ordinary people who had risked their lives to help others escape persecution, families who had opened their homes to strangers, and children who had served as messengers because they could move freely without attracting suspicion. This little girl, he realized, was carrying on that tradition of courage and compassion. After what felt like hours of walking, though it was probably only 30 minutes, they arrived at a small cottage that sat in a grove of apple trees. Warm light glowed from the windows, and Marcus could smell wood smoke from the chimney. The girl led him to the front door, which opened before they could knock. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and alert. "So you are David's son," she said, studying Marcus's face carefully. "Yes, I can see your father in you. Please come inside. We have much to discuss and little time to waste." The cottage interior was simple but comfortable, filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life. Books lined one wall, handmade. Quilts covered the furniture, and the smell of herbal tea filled the air. The old woman gestured for Marcus to sit near the fireplace while she poured tea from a pot that had been waiting for their arrival. "My name is Elena," she said as she settled into a chair across from him. "Your father and my husband Thomas worked together during the dark years. They saved many lives, including some who went on to become leaders in the rebuilding that followed the war. But more importantly for tonight's purpose, they also preserved evidence that could prevent history from repeating itself." Elena paused to sip her tea, her weathered hands steady despite her advanced age. Marcus waited patiently, understanding that this woman had lived through experiences that demanded both respect and careful attention. When she continued, her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed great evil and survived to tell the story. 3 days ago, men came to our village asking questions about wartime activities. They claimed to be historians researching local events, but Thomas taught me long ago how to recognize wolves dressed as sheep. These men were looking for specific information about resistance networks, and they had knowledge that could only have come from inside sources. Someone has betrayed old secrets, and now they're trying to find and destroy evidence that could expose them. Marcus felt his blood grow cold. The idea that people from the old network might be in danger again brought back childhood fears he thought he had outgrown. Elena seemed to sense his distress and leaned forward, her expression both kind and determined. "Your father hid documents that prove several current government officials were collaborators during the war, people who pretended to fight the oppression while secretly helping the persecutors. These documents could destroy careers and possibly prevent these individuals from causing future harm. But if the wrong people find them first, innocent families will suffer, and truth will be buried forever." As Elena spoke, Marcus began to understand why his presence was so crucial. He wasn't just the son of a resistance fighter. He was possibly the only person left alive who knew where his father had hidden these dangerous secrets. The little girl had been right to seek him out, and her grandmother had been wise to trust him with this knowledge. The question now was whether he had the courage to see this mission through to its completion. Elena rose from her chair with surprising agility for someone her age and moved to an old wooden chest that sat beneath the cottage's single window. From inside, she withdrew a collection of items that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. There were photographs of men and women he didn't recognize, documents written in his father's familiar handwriting, and most startling of all, a detailed map that showed the area around his childhood home. "Your father drew this map the night before he died," Elena explained, spreading the parchment across the small wooden table. "He knew his heart was failing, and he wanted to make sure someone else could find what he had hidden. He gave this To my Thomas with instructions that it should only be shared with you if the old dangers returned. Marcus studied the map carefully, recognizing landmarks from his youth. The old oak tree where he had played as a child was marked with a small symbol, as was the well behind their house and the stone wall that had separated their property from the neighbors' fields. But there were other markings too, symbols and notations that meant nothing to him now but must have held significance for his father. Here, Elena said, pointing to a spot on the map that was marked with the same iron cross symbol that appeared on his father's ring. This is where you and your father dug what you thought was the foundation for a new workshop, but the real purpose was to create a hiding place that would survive even if the forge was destroyed. As Elena spoke, Marcus began to remember that night more clearly. He had been perhaps 8 years old, excited to help his father with what seemed like an important project. They had worked by lantern light, his father explaining that some work was best done when curious neighbors were asleep. They had dug deep, much deeper than would have been necessary for a simple workshop foundation, and his father had been very specific about the dimensions and location of their excavation. Inside the hiding place, your father sealed documents that prove 3 current members of the Royal Council were secretly working with the occupying forces during the war, Elena continued. They provided information that led to the capture and execution of many resistance fighters, including my brother and your father's closest friend. After the war ended, these men changed their stories and presented themselves as heroes of the liberation. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. He had sworn an oath to serve and protect the Royal Council, never knowing that some of its members might be the very people his father had died fighting against. The irony was bitter and overwhelming, yet it also provided a clarity he had never experienced before. His true duty was not to protect corrupt officials, but to serve justice and protect innocent people. Elena returned to the chest and withdrew a small cloth bag that clinked softly when she moved it. These are keys that your father made copies of during the war. One of them opens the metal box where the documents are sealed. The others open safe houses and storage places that may still contain supplies the network left behind. Your father believed that someday these resources might be needed again. Marcus accepted the bag of keys, feeling their weight in his palm like a physical connection to his father's memory. Each key represented risks that David the blacksmith had taken, lives that had been saved, and secrets that had been carefully guarded. Now the responsibility for these secrets was passing to his son, along with the choice of what to do with the dangerous knowledge they contained. The men who came to our village will return tomorrow, Elena warned. They're moving systematically through the area, questioning elderly residents who might remember wartime activities. When they realize they're not getting the information they need through intimidation, they'll likely resort to more direct methods. Some of the old network members have already disappeared, and we fear the worst. The little girl, who had been sitting quietly in a corner of the room, suddenly spoke. Grandmother, show him the letter. Her young voice carried an urgency that made both adults turn toward her immediately. Elena nodded and reached once more into the chest. This time she withdrew a piece of paper that looked newer than the other documents, written in a hand that Marcus didn't recognize. As she unfolded it, he could see that it bore an official seal from the Royal Palace. This arrived yesterday through channels we thought had been closed for years, Elena explained. It's from someone inside the palace who calls himself a friend of your father. He warns that orders have been given to search all properties that once belonged to resistance families. They plan to claim they're looking for stolen royal treasures, but the real goal is to find and destroy evidence of collaboration. Marcus read the letter carefully, noting that while it bore no signature, certain phrases and word choices suggested the writer was highly educated and held a position of significant authority. The warning was specific and detailed, providing dates and locations that could only have come from someone with access to sensitive government information. Whoever sent this is taking an enormous risk, Marcus observed. If they're discovered, communicating with resistance families, they could be charged with treason. Yes, Elena agreed. Which means they believe the situation is desperate enough to justify such risk. They've provided us with a window of opportunity that may not come again. Tonight, while the searchers are still organizing their efforts, may be our last chance to recover your father's evidence and ensure it reaches people who can use it properly." Marcus looked around the small cottage, taking in the faces of the elderly woman and young girl who had trusted him with their most dangerous secret. Elena's weathered features showed a lifetime of difficult choices and hard-won wisdom. The little girl's bright eyes held a faith in justice that reminded him why people like his father had been willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of righteousness. "If I recover these documents," Marcus said slowly, "what guarantee do we have that they'll be used wisely? How do we know we're not simply replacing one group of corrupt officials with another?" Elena smiled for the first time that evening, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the strong, determined woman she must have been in her youth. "We don't have guarantees, son of David. We never did. Your father used to say that each generation must choose for itself whether to stand with truth or compromise with evil. The documents will provide evidence, but what people do with that evidence will depend on whether they have courage to demand justice." As the old woman spoke, Marcus realized that his decision had already been made. From the moment the little girl had made her secret gesture at the palace gates, he had been walking a path that led inevitably to this moment. His father's legacy was calling to him across the years, asking him to complete work that had been left unfinished. The question was no longer whether he would help, but whether he had the wisdom and strength to succeed where others had failed. The journey to Marcus's childhood home took nearly 2 hours through winding paths that Elena and the little girl navigated with the expertise of those who had traveled these routes many times before. They moved carefully, avoiding main roads and staying within the cover of trees whenever possible. Marcus found himself amazed at how much the countryside had changed since his youth, yet how certain landmarks remained exactly as he remembered them. As they approached the property where Marcus had grown up, memories flooded back with startling clarity. The forge building still stood, though it had obviously been abandoned for years. Windows were broken, the roof had several holes, and ivy had begun to claim the walls, but the basic structure remained solid, and Marcus could still smell the faint traces of coal smoke that seemed to linger in the very stones. "The new owners never used the forge," Elena explained quietly as they studied the building from the shelter of nearby trees. "They bought the land for farming and let the workshop fall into disrepair. That's been fortunate for our purposes, since it means the hiding place has remained undisturbed." Marcus examined his father's map by moonlight, comparing the drawn symbols with the actual landscape before them. The old oak tree was still there, though much larger than when he was a child. The stone wall had partially collapsed, but enough remained to serve as a reference point. Most importantly, the area where they had dug their secret foundation was now covered by nothing more than tall grass and weeds. "I need to be certain we have the right location before we start digging," Marcus whispered. "If we're discovered excavating someone else's property, it will be difficult to explain our presence here." The little girl surprised them both by producing a small metal object from her pocket. It was a compass, old but well-maintained, and Marcus recognized it immediately as the type his father had used for his metalworking projects. "Grandmother said to bring this," she explained. "She said your father always measured everything precisely, and that the hiding place would be exactly where his calculations indicated." Using the compass and the map's detailed measurements, Marcus was able to triangulate the exact location where he and his father had worked so many years ago. The spot was approximately 20 paces from the forge building, 15 paces from the old oak tree, and positioned so that it would be hidden from view by anyone approaching from the main road. Elena had brought digging tools wrapped in cloth to muffle any sounds they might make. As Marcus began to carefully remove the layers of soil and grass, he was struck by how familiar the task felt. His hands seemed to remember the rhythm of digging, and his muscles recalled the proper technique his father had taught him for moving earth efficiently and quietly. The work was slower than Marcus had anticipated. Years of weather and settling had compacted the soil, and they had to be extremely careful not to make noise that might alert the property's current owners or any neighbors who might be awake. The little girl served as a lookout, positioning herself where she could watch for approaching lights or movement, while the adults focused on their excavation. After what felt like hours of careful digging, Marcus's shovel struck something solid with a muffled metallic sound. Elena immediately moved closer with a small lantern she had kept shuttered until this moment. In the dim light, they could see the corner of what appeared to be a metal box, exactly as Elena had described. Working together, they carefully cleared the soil away from the container. It was larger than Marcus had expected, roughly the size of a small chest, and constructed of heavy metal that showed no signs of rust or corrosion despite its years underground. The box bore the same iron cross symbol that appeared on Marcus's ring and on his father's map, confirming that they had found the right hiding place. The moment Marcus inserted one of his father's keys into the lock, he felt a connection to his father that was almost overwhelming. The key turned smoothly, as if the mechanism had been waiting patiently for this moment to arrive. When the lid opened, Marcus found himself looking at a collection of documents that represented his father's most dangerous secrets. The papers were wrapped in oiled cloth and appeared to be in perfect condition. Elena held the lantern steady while Marcus carefully examined the contents. There were official communications bearing government seals, photographs of meetings between officials and known enemy agents, financial records showing payments made to collaborators, and most damning of all, signed confessions from resistance members who had been tortured into revealing information about their networks. These documents could destroy the careers and reputations of some very powerful people, Marcus observed as he studied the evidence his father had collected. But they could also provide justice for families who never learned the truth about how their loved ones were betrayed. Elena nodded solemnly. Your father believed that truth was more important than peace, if that peace was built on lies and injustice. He often said that secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch, and that sometimes the only cure is to bring them into the light, no matter how painful that might be. As Marcus carefully rewrapped the documents, he noticed something else in the bottom of the metal box. There was a letter addressed to him specifically, written in his father's handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper and began to read his father's final message to him. The letter was brief but powerful. David the blacksmith had written about his hopes for his son's future, his regret that dangerous secrets would someday burden Marcus's life, and his faith that Marcus would choose courage over comfort when the time came to act. The final paragraph brought tears to Marcus's eyes. Son, if you are reading this, it means the work we began together is not yet finished. Trust your heart. Honor the sacrifices of those who came before you, and remember that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is to ensure that truth survives even when truth is dangerous. Looking up from his father's letter, Marcus saw Elena and the little girl watching him with expressions of hope and determination. These were people who had risked everything to preserve justice, and now they were trusting him to complete a mission that had begun before any of them were born. We need to get these documents to someone who can use them properly, Marcus said, carefully placing his father's letter back in the metal box along with the other evidence. But we also need to ensure that the people who are hunting for this information don't realize they've been discovered. Elena smiled, and Marcus could see that she had been hoping he would reach this conclusion. My granddaughter and I have already discussed this possibility, she said, glancing fondly at the brave little girl who had started this entire adventure. We believe we know exactly the right person to receive these documents, someone with both the authority and the integrity to use them wisely. But getting them safely delivered will require one more act of courage from a royal guard who has already given up so much. The return journey to Elena's cottage was filled with tension as they carried the precious documents that could change the course of justice for an entire generation. Marcus had wrapped the metal box in his traveling cloak, but he remained acutely aware of its weight and significance with every step. The pre-dawn darkness provided cover for their movement, yet it also created shadows where dangers might hide. Back at the cottage, Elena prepared a simple meal while she explained her plan for delivering the evidence to the right hands. There is a judge named Catherine Morland who presides over the high court in the capital city, she began, pouring hot soup into wooden bowls. During the war, she was a young lawyer who helped families navigate the legal system when their loved ones were arrested. My husband Thomas assisted her in moving documents that saved dozens of lives. Marcus listened carefully as Elena described Judge Morland's reputation for integrity and her current position of authority within the judicial system. According to Elena, the judge had spent years quietly investigating inconsistencies in wartime records, suspecting that some officials had falsified their roles in the resistance movement. The evidence Marcus had recovered would provide the proof she needed to pursue justice through legal channels. But getting these documents to her safely will be the most dangerous part of our entire mission, Elena warned. The men who are searching for this evidence have contacts throughout the government. If they discover what we've found, they'll use every resource at their disposal to stop us from reaching Judge Moreland. The little girl, who had been unusually quiet since their return from the excavation site, finally spoke up. "Grandmother, what about the messenger routes? The ones Grandfather told us about?" Elena's eyes brightened with approval at her granddaughter's suggestion. "Yes, child, that might be our answer." She turned to Marcus to explain. During the war, the resistance developed a system for moving sensitive information through a network of trusted individuals. Each person would only know one contact in the chain, so if someone was captured, they couldn't betray the entire operation. As Elena described the old communication network, Marcus realized that some of these connections might still exist, maintained by people who understood that the need for such systems could return someday. The challenge would be reactivating contacts who had remained silent for years and convincing them to take enormous risks for the sake of justice. "There's something else we need to consider," Marcus said, studying his father's map one final time. "Once we deliver these documents and Judge Moreland begins her investigation, the people named in this evidence will know their secret has been exposed. They'll likely try to eliminate anyone who might have been involved in recovering the proof against them." Elena nodded gravely. "We've discussed this possibility, my granddaughter and I. We're prepared to leave this area and stay with relatives in distant villages until the immediate danger passes. But what about you, Marcus? Returning to your duties at the palace will be extremely dangerous once these revelations become public." Marcus had been wrestling with this exact question throughout their nighttime adventure. His position as a royal guard provided him with access and credibility that could be crucial for delivering the documents safely. However, once Judge Moreland began her investigation, anyone connected to the recovery of evidence would become a target for those seeking to protect their secrets. "I believe my duty as a guard requires me to ensure these documents reach their destination," Marcus replied after a long moment of consideration. "My father risked everything to preserve this evidence, and the oath I swore to protect the kingdom means protecting it from corruption as well as external threats." The little girl surprised them all by reaching into her pocket and withdrawing another small object. It was a simple wooden whistle, carved with the same symbols they had seen on the map in the metal box. "Grandfather made this for emergency messages," she explained. "If you ever need help, play 3 short notes followed by 2 long ones. Someone from the old network will hear and come to assist you." As dawn approached, they finalized their plan. Marcus would return to the palace and resume his normal duties, while secretly arranging for the documents to be delivered through the old resistance channels. Elena and her granddaughter would begin their journey to safety, carrying word to other network members that the time had come to emerge from hiding once again. The moment of parting was more emotional than any of them had expected. The little girl, who had shown such courage throughout their adventure, finally allowed herself to cry as she hugged Marcus goodbye. Elena pressed a small cloth bundle into his hands, explaining that it contained food for his journey and a letter of introduction that would identify him to Judge Moreland's trusted contacts. As Marcus walked back toward the palace through the early morning light, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in the span of a single night. He was no longer simply a guard following orders and maintaining routines. He had become part of something larger and more important, a continuation of his father's work that could help heal wounds that had festered for too many years. The weight of the documents hidden beneath his cloak felt like a physical reminder of the trust that had been placed in him. Dozens of families had suffered because of the betrayals documented in these papers, and countless more could be protected if the truth finally came to light. Judge Moreland would have the evidence she needed, but success would depend on whether Marcus could navigate the dangerous waters of palace politics without exposing their mission. When Marcus reached the palace gates, He was surprised to find Captain Reynolds waiting for him. The older man's expression was serious but not hostile, and Marcus wondered if his absence had been discovered despite his careful planning. "Marcus, we need to talk," the captain said quietly. "There have been some developments overnight that affect the security of the palace. Reports of suspicious activity in the surrounding countryside. Questions being asked about old wartime connections. I need to know if there's anything you should tell me." For a moment, Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. Had their mission been discovered? Were Elena and the little girl already in danger? But as he studied Captain Reynolds's face, Marcus noticed something that gave him hope. The older man was making the same subtle hand gesture that the little girl had used at the palace gates, the ancient sign of the resistance network. "Captain," Marcus said carefully, "I believe there are some things we need to discuss in private, things that concern both our duty to the crown and our responsibility to justice." Captain Reynolds nodded and gestured for Marcus to follow him to a secluded area of the palace grounds. As they walked, Marcus realized that the network Elena had described was larger and more resilient than any of them had imagined. His father's legacy lived on not just in hidden documents, but in the hearts and minds of people who continued to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience. The sun was fully risen by the time Marcus finished explaining the night's events to Captain Reynolds. The older man listened without interruption, his experienced face showing both concern and admiration for the risks that had been taken. When Marcus reached the end of his story, Captain Reynolds was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of what he had heard. "Your father would be proud," he finally said. "And Judge Moreland will indeed receive these documents through channels that will protect everyone involved. The old network never truly disappeared, Marcus. It simply learned to be more patient and more careful. Today we begin the work of ensuring that justice delayed does not become justice denied." As Marcus prepared to resume his duties, he understood that his life would never return to its previous simplicity. He had answered the call that came with his father's blood and his own conscience, and there would be consequences that stretched far into an uncertain future. But he had also discovered something invaluable: the knowledge that courage could bridge generations, that truth could survive even when buried beneath years of silence, and that sometimes the smallest gesture from the most unlikely messenger could change the course of history itself. The little girl's secret gesture had led him home to his true purpose, and Marcus knew that wherever the path ahead might lead, he would walk it with the strength that came from completing his father's unfinished work.